Hello everybody, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Welcome to today's Critical Thought discussing metagames in competitive game design. This is based on my recent post looking at 5 important tips or details to look at if you want to add metagame elements to your competitive game. We'll talk about my prop in a second here. Metagame is one of those terms that it can mean different things depending upon who you're talking to. At its basic level, a metagame is essentially systems or mechanics that will influence how a game is played. These mechanics don't actually, all I'm trying to say, they don't essentially interact with the game itself, but they still have an influence on it. And it's better to talk about some examples. Probably the biggest ones that you guys have probably played would be either Team Fortress 2 or League of Legends. Team Fortress 2, of course, has tons and tons of items at this point. The items themselves don't change how you're going to play the game in the sense of, let's say, an item that gives the scout the ability to cloak, like the spy. But they influence how the game is played, whether from an aesthetic point of view of, hats and customs or champion skins in League of Legends, or from a gameplay point of view, but again through the use of minor alterations or side grades. Keep the idea of side grades in the back of your mind for now. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. At the other end of the extreme, the meta, it can also be used in competitive games to describe the most popular strategy or the flavor of the month build. Anyone who's played or followed Hearthstone has probably heard the term meta thrown around. In this point, the meta is essentially what you're, like, the forecast of what to expect. If the meta says that, unfortunately I don't follow too much Hearthstone, so I can't give concrete examples, but let's say a specific minion or a specific spell combination is very popular. So the meta would take to expect those kinds of cards in someone's deck. This would mean that for a lot of players they would build their decks around that, or players would basically do a counter pick and design their decks to specifically counter that. There was a period where the zoo style was very, very popular in Hearthstone, and this caused a lot of players to essentially build their decks either to use that or counter it. When it comes to metagame design, this is one of the most trickier and very nitpicky aspects to get around, because every little system, every little detail you add is going to influence how the game is played. That takes me to my prop here. It's so big I can't stand up. This is from way back in the day. It was a collection of all the cards that were available in Magic the Gathering when it first came out. This is very, very old at this point. Probably most of this is not even relevant anymore. But the reason why it's our prop today is that it represents a competitive game with a meta. This is both in how the cards were designed and in terms of what was popular, what's good, what's hot, etc. Competitive game designers typically avoid gameplay affecting metagame or meta mechanics, because not only is it a lot more work, but it essentially creates a nesting doll of balance you always have to keep track of. Hearthstone has had nothing but trouble with trying to battle against its own meta, as competitive players found the best use or the best combination of cards. This got to the casual and core gamers and essentially create a lot of flavor of the month builds. With that said, you can't just bounce and change stats willy-nilly. Because of the meta and how these things all interact with each other, simply affecting things by like 1 point or affecting the cost of a card by 1 mana can massively change how the game is played. And you can look at a lot of the Hearthstone design changes that have happened over the last few years, such as changing the auctioneer's mana costs, or a few of the lower cost cards raising up by 1. And from the outset, you may think that just going from 1 mana to 2 is not that big of a deal, or 3 to 2. But every little change will impact all the other decisions around that. And that's why metagame choices are very challenging to add. And it's also why I'm very curious and a little bit worried about what they're going to do with Injustice 2. For those of you who haven't been following, Injustice 2 is obviously the sequel to Injustice 1. This was the DC, I guess, equivalent of Mortal Kombat 9 or 10 at the time from NetherRealm Studios. Now, the original game had costumes and skins, which was sort of like the aesthetic meta. But with Injustice 2, the developers are adding options that you can attach to your character that impact how they're played. And this can mean maybe increasing projectile speed, or increasing the amount of damage someone would do, or maybe reduces damage taken while blocking. And there are countless number of ways they can go about this. And the reason why I'm worried is that they're trying to essentially have their cake and eat it too, with appealing to the casual and the competitive side. Casual and core gamers like metagame because it basically gives them more options and makes them more varied. Competitive gamers, however, are a little bit different. They like to break these games down to levels I can't even begin to contemplate. You can see this with any competitive, I'm talking master level play, stuff that you see in MLG or EVO each year. Because of that, they're not fans when you're starting to fiddle around with characters in such a way. Because one, it's very easy to make overpowered or the best strategies. And two, it kind of robs competitive play of sort of the mind game aspect. When you're picking characters and you're trying to decide, okay, I'm going to play this guy this way, and he's not expecting that. And there's a lot of basically the player trying to read the opponent, saying, okay, he likes to throw projectiles, so I'm going to try and play around that. But maybe he thinks I'm going to play around that, so he's going to switch. When you start throwing in metagame aspects, it starts to throw that for a spin. Now it's like, okay, now he's wearing a green shirt. Maybe that means his character has increased speed. Oh, but I'm wearing my red top hat. That means I get uppercuts more. Now, Mortal Kombat 10 did have examples of meta, with how essentially each character was 3 characters in one, depending upon what you chose as their, I forget the exact term, I think it was a mastery or discipline or something like that. And this was okay because it was a meta within set conditions. If someone picks Raiden's Thunder God option, that limits what they can do depending upon if they pick one of his other ones, or Sub-Zero or Goro or anything like that. So while there were still choices, players still knew from essentially a base level what they were expecting. When you go complete meta, and that's something like Team Fortress, or what they're doing with Justice 2, you have to be a lot more careful there. Now, I know that with Injustice 2, NetherRealm has already announced that they're going to have the option to essentially turn off the boosts, or turn off the item's effects, and essentially just keep them as costumes for competitive play. But therein lies another problem. If your core or casual players are building their characters and doing this whole meta thing, if all that stuff doesn't matter for competitive play, they may not become interested in learning the game or growing it. Now, another example of meta I want to bring up, in terms of how it can influence the game without directly manipulating the mechanics, would be something like Payday II, and what developers have done with the different classes or the different masteries you can choose. They even go as far as having the skill loadout. In this case, the meta has been shifted and altered a lot. Even though the game is not competitive, players have found the best ways or the best ways to build. And again, once it has been discovered, it becomes a de facto way of play and renders all those choices moot. If I know that X, Y, and Z are always the best options, why should I go with anything else? And that leads to a lot of the problems with adding metagame design to a competitive layer. With League of Legends, they do have, I think it's sort of like their talent system, But what they do is make those choices very, very minute. They also have their rune page as well, at least the last time I played. So the boosts are nothing crazy like, plus 200% damage or increased speed by 5 times. The choices are kept very, very small because they know that each one of those choices is going to impact the game in massive ways. And that's one of the key points I talked about in my posts. If you're going to do choices like that, you have to keep them small. Even though players would like to have plus 20 damage to their punches, that would just break the game. Now, another example that I want to touch on briefly before we wrap up today's critical thought is the use of side grades. And that's a very important concept that has been coined by Team Fortress 2. What the developers have done is, instead of just flat out raising stats or giving you superpowers, a lot of their items come with a negative, something to balance the fact that they're giving you a positive boost. So one item could be the soldier's rockets do more damage, but will no longer randomly crit. Or Heavy's gun has less speed up time, but lower range. These are ways to essentially work around the idea of these set builds while still giving the player some way to personalize or affect how their character plays. And it's a very brilliant use of the meta. One thing I roll my eye. Because again, it allows them, in this case, to have their cake and eat it too. They can throw in all these wild and character affecting items, but they know that not one item is going to basically be the best, because they're always changing and affecting the player. And it's harder to come up with the best or most optimized ways when you have side grades that are also making the character worse in some aspect. And it also gives them a wider margin for item design. Because they're not just worried about making items better, they also have to think about how to make them worse. So they can come up with a lot more ways of customizing their characters this way. Now, we are approaching the 13-minute mark, so we're going to wrap up today's critical thought. But again, this is a topic that's not going to be easily discussed in one video. We can come back to this in any number of ways. If you have any questions or particular topics regarding metagame design you would like me to cover, be sure to leave them in the comments below. But other than that, thanks for watching today's critical thought. I'll be back tomorrow with another one. Thanks again, and see you all again real soon. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment, of course, share with your friends. It always helps out. Check out game-wisdom.com, where I examine the art and science of games. You can follow me on Twitch and Twitter under GW Bycer for the latest updates of new content. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign. You can find us on Patreon under Game Wisdom if you would like to donate and help contribute to keeping Game Wisdom going. Your donations can not only give us the monthly funding we need to keep supporting ourselves, but if we can hit some goals, it will mean more great content for you, and there are some nifty little rewards there as well. Thanks for watching this video, and be sure to tune in to the next one real soon.